Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unseen truth behind the ticket. Harry Daniels wiped the sweat from his brow, carefully stacking clean trays in the small kitchen of a bustling soup kitchen. The rich aroma of simmering broth mixed with the sharp scent of dish soap filled the air as he glanced around the room. It was spotless now, the last of the guests having been served their warm meals for the day. "Thanks for everything today, Harry," called out Janet, the shelter's coordinator. Her voice was warm and familiar, her gray-streaked hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Harry flashed her a gentle smile. "You know I wouldn't miss it for the world. Wednesdays are my favorite." Janet laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not many billionaires would say that while scrubbing pots." He chuckled. "That's because they're chasing the wrong kind of riches." This wasn't just lip service. Harry believed it. As the founder and CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, he could afford any luxury his heart desired. Mansions, private jets, and fast cars could easily fill his life. Instead, he chose a modest home, a 10-year-old Toyota Camry, and hours spent volunteering in shelters across the country. His childhood had been different from his current reality. Harry had grown up in a struggling household, watching his single mother work double shifts just to put food on the table. Those formative years, filled with financial hardship and community kindness, had shaped his values. No amount of money could replace the lessons he had learned about empathy and humility. Checking the time, Harry realized he needed to head to the airport. His flight home was in a little over an hour, and Chicago traffic was nothing to underestimate. He grabbed his worn leather backpack, his travel companion for nearly a decade, and slung it over his shoulder. The airport was buzzing with activity as Harry made his way through the terminal. People hurried past him, dragging their suitcases, clutching coffee cups, or glued to their phones. In his jeans, sneakers, and a plain gray hoodie, Harry blended effortlessly into the crowd, just the way he liked it. At the check-in counter, Harry waited patiently in line. When it was his turn, the attendant, a young man with a crisp uniform, barely looked up from his screen. "Destination?" the attendant asked, flatly. "Los Angeles," Harry replied, handing over his ID. The attendant scanned the ticket, his brow furrowing slightly. He glanced at Harry, his eyes taking in the casual attire, before returning to the screen. Without a word, he printed the boarding pass and pushed it across the counter. "Next?" Harry accepted the boarding pass with a polite nod and stepped aside, noticing the stark difference in how other travelers were treated. The businessman behind him received a wide smile and a cheerful, "Have a great flight, sir." Harry let the moment pass without comment. He had long since grown used to assumptions about his appearance. As Harry approached the gate for his flight, the line for first-class boarding was already forming. He joined the queue, his ticket ready in hand. The gate agent greeted the passenger in front of him warmly but barely glanced at Harry as he scanned his pass. "First-class cabin is on the left as you board," the agent mumbled, motioning him forward. Stepping onto the plane, Harry took in the gleaming interior of the first-class cabin. Plush leather seats were arranged in a spacious layout, and the scent of fresh linen and citrus cleaner filled the air. He moved toward his assigned seat, near the window. Before he could sit down, a voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Harry turned to see a tall flight attendant with a sharp uniform and an even sharper expression. Her name tag read Linda. "Can I help you?" Harry asked, his tone polite. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is the first-class section," she said pointedly. "I know," Harry replied, holding up his boarding pass. Linda's gaze hardened. "I'll need to see that." Harry handed it to her without hesitation. She scrutinized the pass, flipping it over and inspecting it as if it might be counterfeit. Around them, other passengers shifted uncomfortably, some watching the interaction with curiosity, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Where did you purchase this ticket?" Linda demanded, her tone sharp. "Through the airline's website," Harry replied evenly. Her eyebrows shot up. These seats cost thousands of dollars, she said, the disbelief evident in her voice. Harry's calm demeanor didn't waver. I'm aware. Linda's jaw tightened. I've been working first-class flights for over a decade, and I've never seen you before. Harry offered a small smile. I guess there's a first time for everything. Unconvinced, Linda handed back the boarding pass with visible reluctance. Take your seat, she said, her tone cold. Harry settled into his seat, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. He could feel Linda's eyes on him as she moved about the cabin, her demeanor sharp and disapproving. Minutes later, Linda was back. Sir, she began, her voice louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane for additional verification. Harry looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. Is there an issue with my ticket? I've called security, Linda said briskly. They'll handle this from here. Around them, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, some whispering to each other. Harry stood, retrieving his backpack from the overhead compartment. He moved with quiet dignity, following the security officers who had arrived moments earlier. As he stepped off the plane, Linda watched with satisfaction, smoothing her uniform and resuming her duties as if she had just solved a major issue. But in her rush to judge, Linda had made a mistake that would change her life forever. The spark of consequences. Harry stepped into the terminal with measured composure, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He kept his head held high, his outward calm masking the flicker of disappointment in his heart. In his decades of success, Harry had dealt with many forms of prejudice and judgment. Yet, this moment, a public dismissal based on appearance alone, struck a deeper chord. He moved to a quiet corner near the gate and placed his worn backpack on a chair. The large windows stretched across the terminal wall, revealing airplanes gliding across the tarmac. One of them was his flight, now preparing for takeoff without him. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a man in casual clothes, unremarkable to any passerby. Harry pulled out his phone, his fingers scrolling through contacts until he found the name he was looking for, James Matthews, his longtime friend and corporate attorney. Pressing the call button, he brought the phone to his ear. Harry. James answered warmly. How's it going? Aren't you supposed to be mid-flight? Harry's lips quirked into a half-smile. I was supposed to be. Plans changed. James immediately picked up on the tone. What happened? Harry explained briefly, recounting the events with his usual measured tone, omitting the personal sting of the humiliation he'd endured. But James knew Harry too well to miss the weight behind the words. They kicked you off the flight? For what reason? James asked, his voice incredulous. I think you can guess, Harry replied softly. A pause. Say no more. I'll get the legal team on this immediately. You want this handled quietly or publicly? Harry considered for a moment, watching as his flight taxied away from the gate. For now, quietly. But I want to make sure no one else goes through this. Call the board as well. They need to hear about this directly. James's tone shifted to one of focus. Understood. Sit tight, I'll take care of it. Back on the plane, Linda was all smiles as she moved through the first-class cabin. Her earlier encounter with Harry seemed to have given her an air of confidence. She carried herself with the practiced poise of someone who believed she had done the right thing. As she passed out drinks and arranged trays, her fellow flight attendants exchanged glances. One of them, a younger woman named Elena, finally spoke up. Linda, she said cautiously, her voice low, are you sure about what happened earlier? Linda arched an eyebrow. What do you mean? Elena hesitated. Well, the passenger you asked to leave, he had a valid ticket. And? Linda's tone was clipped. And he didn't seem like he was causing any trouble. I mean, shouldn't we have double-checked before calling security? Linda stiffened. Elena, I've been doing this job for over 15 years. I know when someone doesn't belong in first class. Trust me. Elena nodded reluctantly, though the unease in her eyes remained. Meanwhile, the gears of accountability were already in motion. Harry's call to James had set off a chain reaction. Within minutes, his team of attorneys was drafting emails, making calls, and compiling reports. Harry's reputation as a hands-on leader who treated people with respect had earned him a network of loyal allies across industries. One such ally was Catherine Hughes, a senior executive at the airline. When James's email landed in her inbox, she opened it immediately, her expression darkening as she read the details. "Get me the operations manager," Catherine ordered her assistant. Moments later, she was on a call with the captain of Harry's flight. Back on the plane, Linda's day took an unexpected turn when the intercom crackled. "Linda, please report to the cockpit immediately," the captain's voice said, his tone sharp. Linda frowned but complied, smoothing her uniform as she walked. She entered the cockpit to find Captain Stevens looking at her with an expression that was far from pleased. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Linda asked, her tone still crisp. "Yes, Linda. There is," he said, his voice low but firm. "I just received a call from corporate. The passenger you removed, Harry Daniels, isn't just any traveler. He's one of our largest shareholders and sits on the board of directors." Linda's mouth fell open. "What? But, he didn't look." "Didn't look like what?" the captain interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Linda's words faltered. I thought." "You thought wrong," Stevens snapped. "This isn't just about a mistake, Linda. Your actions could cost us more than one passenger. This could cost the airline its reputation." Linda's hands began to tremble. "I didn't mean." "That's irrelevant now," the captain said sharply. "Corporate has ordered a review of the incident, and you're expected to report to the head office as soon as we land. I suggest you start preparing your explanation." Linda's world began to spin. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but now, she was faced with the harsh reality of her own biases and the potential consequences of her actions. Harry, meanwhile, sat quietly in the terminal. He wasn't interested in vengeance, but in creating a teachable moment. Prejudice, he believed, was often rooted in ignorance rather than malice. Still, the airline needed to address what had happened, not just for his sake, but for every other passenger who might face similar treatment. As he waited, his phone buzzed with a message from James. "Board notified. Catherine Hughes is personally looking into the matter. Expect an update soon." Harry sighed, leaning back in his chair. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the terminal floor. Somewhere, a lesson was beginning to take root, a lesson that would change Linda's life forever. A public reckoning. The plane touched down with a jarring thud, but the turbulence Linda felt wasn't from the landing. Each announcement from the cockpit during the flight had sounded heavier to her ears. Every passenger interaction, though routine, seemed like a mirror reflecting her earlier actions. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Linda stood at the front of the cabin, forcing herself to smile while preparing to say goodbye to the passengers. Her hands, usually steady, fidgeted with the hem of her uniform jacket. The final announcement from Captain Stevens made her stomach churn. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We'd like to acknowledge our board member and valued shareholder, Mr. Harry Daniels, who was unable to join us for this flight. On behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize for any inconvenience." The passengers murmured among themselves, the name unfamiliar to most but impossible to ignore after the announcement. Linda felt as though every set of eyes in first class had shifted to her, their gazes a mix of curiosity, confusion, and judgment. As the passengers disembarked, Linda's polished facade began to crack. Her colleagues noticed, but didn't offer her the usual small talk or supportive smiles. It was clear, word of her mistake had spread. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Harry sat in a private lounge, typing quietly on his laptop. His fingers moved deliberately as he composed an email to the airline's board, his tone firm yet professional. He outlined the details of what had transpired, emphasizing the need for systemic change. Harry paused, rereading his words, before hitting send. While his focus was on creating a better experience for all passengers, the weight of what had happened lingered. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the reminder that bias still pervaded even the most routine aspects of life. Moments later, his phone buzzed with a call from Catherine Hughes. "Harry," Catherine began, her voice calm but earnest, "I want to personally apologize for what happened today. We're taking this very seriously." "I appreciate that, Catherine," Harry replied. "But an apology alone won't change things. This isn't just about me, it's about the culture you foster within your airline. If someone like me, someone with influence and resources, can be treated this way, imagine how often this happens to those without the same privilege." Catherine sighed. "You're absolutely right. We've already initiated a full investigation. The flight attendant in question is being called in for a meeting with senior management. We're also revisiting our diversity training programs. I want you to know this won't be swept under the rug." "Good," Harry said, his tone steady. "Because if it is, I'll make sure the public hears about it." At the airline's headquarters, Linda sat in a stark conference room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the table sat two members of senior management, their expressions unreadable. "Linda," began Mr. Carter, the head of operations, "do you understand the gravity of what happened on your flight today?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. You removed a first-class passenger who not only had a valid ticket but happens to be one of our most influential shareholders," Carter continued, his tone stern. "What's worse, your actions appear to have been motivated by assumptions about his appearance." Linda's face burned with shame. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," she said quickly. "I thought I was acting in the best interest of the passengers and crew." Carter raised a hand, cutting her off. "That excuse might work if this were an isolated incident. But we've received prior complaints about your conduct, Linda. While none were as severe as this, they show a troubling pattern." Her eyes widened. "Complaints? About me?" "Yes," said the second manager, Ms. Rivera, her voice softer but no less firm. "Passengers and colleagues have noted instances where your tone and behavior have been dismissive, particularly toward people who don't fit a certain profile." Linda's heart sank. She had always prided herself on being professional, but hearing these words made her realize how blind she had been to her own actions. "We're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately," Carter said, his words final. "During this time, you'll undergo intensive training on bias, inclusivity, and customer service. Whether or not you return to work will depend on your willingness to take accountability and change." News of the incident began to spread beyond the confines of the airline. Harry's story, though initially kept private, reached the ears of a journalist who had once interviewed him about his philanthropic efforts. The journalist, intrigued by the irony of a billionaire being kicked off a flight he partially owned, reached out to Harry for comment. "I'm not interested in sensationalizing this," Harry told her. "But if sharing my experience can shine a light on the broader issue of prejudice, then I'm willing to talk." The resulting article, titled "When Appearance Deceives, the Billionaire Mistaken for a Nobody," quickly went viral. Readers were captivated by Harry's humility and the blatant unfairness of what had happened. The article painted a stark picture of the biases that still plagued modern society, sparking debates across social media. #JusticeForHarry began trending, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. The airline, now in the spotlight, issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and outlining the steps they were taking to prevent future occurrences. Linda watched the fallout from the confines of her small apartment. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, some from colleagues offering tepid support, others from strangers condemning her actions. The article about Harry was the hardest to read. She had dismissed him based on assumptions, yet here was a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, despite his immense wealth. For the first time in years, Linda allowed herself to reflect deeply on her behavior. She thought about the small, subtle ways she had judged people based on their clothes, their accents, their skin color. She had always believed she was fair, but now, she saw how far she had fallen short. She picked up her phone and opened an email draft she had started earlier. Addressed to Harry Daniels, it was an apology, raw, unfiltered, and deeply sincere. Back at his home, Harry read Linda's email with quiet contemplation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He replied simply. Accountability is the first step. The next is action. I hope you'll use this experience to grow, not as a punishment but as a lesson. A journey toward redemption. As the weeks passed, the shockwaves from the incident continued to ripple through both the airline and Linda's life. For Harry, the situation had been one of deep personal reflection, and while he was committed to bringing change, he also recognized the power of second chances. He had been where Linda was, someone who had made rash judgments, only to later realize the consequences of their actions. Linda, on the other hand, found herself standing at a crossroads. The days after the incident had been an emotional whirlwind. At first, the overwhelming weight of the situation paralyzed her. She had never experienced such public shame. Her career was in jeopardy, and her personal integrity was called into question. Yet, as she began her mandatory training on bias and inclusivity, something inside her started to shift. The first few days of her leave were difficult. Linda couldn't escape the voices of doubt that circled in her head. What had she done? Why had she acted in such a way? And why, despite her years of service, had she failed to see the humanity in the people around her? The workshops she attended were uncomfortable. They forced her to confront her own prejudices, things she had never even considered biases before. She learned about the subconscious ways in which people of different races, genders, and social classes were treated differently. The facts were undeniable. Every word spoken in those sessions cut into her self-image, each realization more painful than the last. She felt her world unraveling, like she was being forced to rebuild herself from the ground up. But something else happened, too. With each new lesson, Linda found herself taking more responsibility for her actions. She began to understand how deeply ingrained her assumptions were, and how easily she had allowed her judgments to affect others. She also realized that Harry's treatment wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, systemic problem, one that needed to be addressed not just in the airline, but in society as a whole. One evening, several weeks after the incident, Linda sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her laptop. A draft email to Harry had been open for days. She had started it more than once, but each time, her words felt hollow and insufficient. She had apologized in her previous message, but now, she needed to do more. She needed to offer him more than just a few words of regret. She needed to show him that she had learned, and that she was willing to change. Finally, she took a deep breath and began typing. Subject: A new beginning. Dear Harry, I've spent the past several weeks reflecting on what happened on that flight, and I can't tell you how deeply sorry I am for what I did. I was wrong in so many ways, and I can only hope that you can understand how much I regret treating you the way I did. When I removed you from that plane, I acted out of ignorance and assumptions. I made decisions based on appearances and preconceived notions rather than the truth. I didn't see you for who you are. I didn't see your worth, your generosity, or your dedication to others. I simply saw a man who didn't fit into the box I had created for first-class passengers, and for that, I failed you. But over the last few weeks, I've learned a lot about myself, about biases, and about the damage we can do when we let our prejudices guide our actions. I am ashamed of the person I was before, but I am committed to changing. I want you to know that your actions, your dignified response in the face of my cruelty, have inspired me. I've started a personal journey to not only understand the impact of my behavior, but to actively work on being better, doing better, and making the world around me better. I've already signed up for additional training on diversity and inclusion, and I am committed to making sure that this never happens again to anyone. If you ever feel comfortable, I would love to meet you in person and learn more about your perspective. I know this may not fix everything, but I hope it will be a step in the right direction. Sincerely, Linda. Linda stared at the screen for a moment, the cursor blinking at her. She read the message again. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. It felt like the start of something new, both for her and for the way she viewed the world. With a sigh, she clicked send. Across town, Harry was sitting in his home office when the email notification popped up on his screen. He had been dreading the moment he would hear from Linda again. The last time he had read her name in an email, it was full of defensiveness and excuses. But this message was different. Harry took a deep breath and opened it. As he read her words, something shifted inside him. Linda wasn't offering excuses this time. She was offering accountability, vulnerability, and a genuine desire to learn. He thought about his own journey, how, for years, he had worked on using his wealth and position to help others, but also how much he had grown as a person through those experiences. He thought about how he had once assumed the worst in people, had judged others based on superficial details, and how he had learned to stop doing that. Harry knew that healing and forgiveness didn't come from perfection, but from effort. He quickly typed his reply. Subject, a new beginning. Dear Linda. Thank you for your email. I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to confront your actions. I've always believed that real growth comes from being able to look at ourselves in the mirror and take responsibility for what we've done. What you've done in these last few weeks is something many people wouldn't be willing to do. It's easy to stand by our beliefs, even when they hurt others. It's much harder to change and admit our faults. You've already taken the hardest step, and that's the first step toward becoming a better version of yourself. I believe in second chances. I believe that people can grow, and I see the effort you're putting into this. If you ever want to talk or need any guidance on this journey, I'm here. Let's both continue to learn and evolve. Wishing you all the best. Harry. Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her as she read Harry's response. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of her apology, it was a recognition of her effort, her willingness to change. It felt like the first real step in the process of rebuilding not just her career, but her character. Over the next few months, Linda's efforts to improve didn't go unnoticed. Her colleagues at the airline observed her commitment to inclusivity and her newfound humility. She began to mentor other flight attendants, leading workshops on treating all passengers with respect and empathy, regardless of their background. Linda's change wasn't just about avoiding the mistakes she had made, it was about actively fostering a culture of kindness and understanding. Meanwhile, Harry continued to support causes that promoted equity and inclusion, using his position and wealth to back organizations dedicated to fighting bias and empowering marginalized communities. In his conversations with Linda, he shared insights into how his experiences shaped him, reminding her that it wasn't the destination that mattered, but the journey. 1 year after that fateful flight, Linda found herself on the same route again, but this time, she was ready. She boarded the plane with a smile on her face, knowing that the person she was today was different from the person who had once judged based on appearances. As she walked down the aisle, she saw a familiar face. It was Harry, now traveling with his family, but he recognized her immediately. He smiled warmly, a look of recognition in his eyes. Good to see you, Linda, he said, his voice filled with quiet warmth. Good to see you, too, Harry, she replied, her smile genuine. In that moment, Linda knew that redemption wasn't a single event, but a continuous journey, a journey that she would never stop walking. And she knew that, thanks to Harry, she had taken the first step.